Dr. Kern, to continue our discussions from the other day, I'd like you to look at how low noise thinking interprets nightmares.
Okay, so the question is, what is a nightmare, right? And there's an old saying, if you know the structure of a drug, then you'll know how the drug works. Same thing here. You have to know the structure of a nightmare, the whole psychodynamics is why we have nightmares. Okay, so we have to go back to low noise thinking, and when we talk about low noise thinking, we mean we're actually referring to 4 different levels of noise: high noise, normal noise, low noise, and zero noise. All right. Now, at night, what happens? The noise level of your surround drops down quite a bit. All right. And now, if it drops down too far, then every part of the brain communicates with every other part of the brain, and you get what is called a nightmare, otherwise known as information overload. And what happens is when you wake up from a nightmare, you still see it, and you feel it's real when it's not real. You have to pinch yourself or something. So a nightmare stems from having very low noise where there's images, all sorts of images stored throughout the brain or wherever the image storage center is. So it's something you can't see. This is how we're programmed. It's either the brain is hardware, but the program is the software. So we're basically dealing with a computer versus a human being. And the one thing that sets a human being different from the brain is only one word, and that's called randomness. So randomness, man has never been able to build a random noise generator or a random anything. Sooner or later, things repeat. However, in the biological arena, you can't have 2 fingerprints alike. You can't have 2 voices that are alike. You can't have 2 pictures that are alike. They're all different. It's all random. All right, so now, the brain has an enormous amount of storage. A computer runs out of space. So when you talk about digital, you have to buy a certain amount of disk space, basically disk space to record. And when you run out of disk space, that's the end. But the brain never runs out of storage. And why is that? Well, in a computer, you're working with digits. It's digital. Digits take up electronic or radio space, whatever it is. It's digital. All right. But in the brain, we're not dealing with digital. We're dealing with a different type of information called analog. In other words, waveforms, invisible or visible waveforms. And the interesting thing about waveforms is that they are stackable. So there theoretically is an infinite number of waveforms you can stack onto a pinhead. All right? I mean, we're talking about something that is infinite in nature. Remember that when we're talking about biological systems, we're talking about things that infer infinity, very high numbers. It's very high, and you can go on forever and ever and ever. Sooner or later, in a computer it repeats, but in a human brain it doesn't. But because waveforms in a human brain are stackable, and there's an infinite number of waveforms that it can stack, there's no limit to the amount. I mean, your brain can theoretically hold all the information in the entire Library of Congress and every business office, wherever there's information, it can be stored. So as to all the different applications, we can go into that at another time. But so that we get the basic understanding, did I answer your questions, Lance?
I'd like you to talk a bit more about nightmares.
Okay. Anything specifically that you want me to talk about nightmares?
Yeah, well, I suppose with low noise thinking, can we exaggerate nightmares? Does it explain whatever happens in our brain, or is it random?
Well, as I mentioned, nightmares occur when the noise level drops down to low levels. And a nightmare, and the brain as we said, the brain stores everything. Good, bad, ugly, doesn't matter. It stores every image. I mean, technically, you probably remember when you were born, everything in your mind was dark, and then it became light. That's, all of a sudden you're born. It's analogous to that. But a nightmare will occur in situations where there is information overload. And in order to get information overload, the resistance, in other words, think about noise as being like a resistor. It's being like pushing uphill. It's work, it's energy. So when the noise level drops down to zero, the resistance to outside stimuli in the brain or outside the brain goes up enormously, right? And when we talk about noise, we're not just talking about noise. We're talking about any type of electronic or broadcast signal. It all has a ratio called the signal-to-noise ratio. The signal level is in the numerator and the noise in the denominator. So when you get a number that drops down to near zero, the ratio goes up to infinity, because one or any number divided by zero is infinity, which is, off the wall, basically.
Dr. Kern, in your book, which is available, of course, you also focus on suicide, which is a major problem worldwide. How can low noise thinking assist in understanding that?
Okay, well, every part of the brain has a different image or function, or it could be motor, it could be visual, it could be auditory, it could be any of those. There's no limit. Remember, it's random. It's totally random. The biological system is totally random. The only part that's not random is the actual signal or information content. That's not random. But if it's real in the mind, for all intents and purposes, it's real as far as you're concerned. In a dream, if you dream whatever you dream in the dream, it's kind of like fake news. It's there, but it's not there, all right? And very often when we wake up from a nightmare, we'll still have the after effects. We'll still think that, gee, you're confused because you don't know if it's true or not true, because you've stored fake news as well. Remember, the brain takes in everything. All right, there's not a thing it can't do. And so now, with a nightmare, now we're talking about suicide. Suicide, again, as I said, every part of the brain has different function, different whatever. In a suicidal situation, you could think of that there's a certain point somewhere in the brain, it's invisible, called computer software, or, it's not an actual physical thing, it's a waveform. It can be stacked, there's all different, anyway, it's randomness. So in a suicidal person has an area in the brain that sends out a wrong signal. And it does it repetitively. Like, for instance, it'll say, kill yourself, kill yourself, kill yourself, kill yourself. And you cannot stop it, you can't block it, you can't take drugs, nothing will block it, because that stimulus is there for all of your life. And therefore, a lot of people think, oh, gee, if I didn't do that, that person, my friend or brother or whatever, wouldn't have committed suicide. Well, that's not true. Suicide has nothing to do with any external factor. It's totally internal. You have a damaged area in the brain will send out an error signal, a false information message, and if it goes on for a long period of time, you give up. You succumb to that repetitive wrong information, that wrong whatever, and so how do you treat it? Well, the first step, there is no treatment at this point. That's what, what are you going to do? Go in and do brain surgery on somebody or whatever? You can't. Or you want to stimulate, put some headphones on and blast a lot of noise. Maybe it might work. But it's going to happen when nobody's around or nobody's expecting it, and that's when you do it. In other words, it's something that's been very carefully planned. Suicides are very carefully planned by the one that commits suicide. And you cannot blame yourself. So here, like this thing in the news today with Christian Porter, the Attorney General, his girlfriend from teenage years commits suicide. Of course, there's no proof because there's no body, right? But now the public is saying that, he caused grief or whatever it is. When the key thing there is that suicide is an internal thing. There's no amount of prevention or stimuli that you can do to prevent it. It's just going to happen when you give up. So the moment you give up fighting that image, which you cannot, just like schizophrenia, all these different, like schizophrenia, like depression, these are areas of the brain that are sending out signals that are false. And these signals are so real that you think it's true. For instance, in schizophrenia, you picture images, you think, you hear voices, you see things that are not there to me, but they're there for that person. So whatever is in the brain, in the mind, is reality for that individual, technically speaking, reality. Yeah. So what is reality? Is how it is. So there are going to be situations where you're totally in a different space mentally, and yet it all looks true. It all appears as being true.